Another panel, and Jeff Marti, Lanaya Blakely, and David Hoekema are representing Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, and we're going to be talking about basically a review of climate impacts on water management within each state. So I'd like to introduce the three speakers and then have them come up one by one and then take questions at the end. Jeff Marti is an environmental planner and drought coordinator for the Washington State Department of Ecology. He chairs the Washington State Drought Contingency Planning Task Force and also the State Water Supply Availability Committee. He has a BS from Iowa State University and a Master's of Environmental Studies from the Evergreen State College. And then Lanaya Blakely is the Drought Research Assistant within the Oregon Water Resources Department. She serves as the Drought Research Assistant for the Task Force on Drought Emergency Response, established by House Bill 4113. She also works on water right transactions, stream flow restoration, and water issues in the Klamath Basin as a water right application analyst. And David Hoekema is a PhD student studying biological engineering at the University of Idaho's Boise campus. He previously obtained a bachelor's degree in civil engineering from U of I and a master's in civil engineering from Boise State. His graduate research and the publications produced have focused on how climate impacts crop water demand, incidental recharge, and priority allocation in the Snake River Basin. He's currently employed as a hydrologist within the Idaho Department of Water Resources in the Service Water Hydrology section. So let's welcome the three of them, and Jeff will be up shortly. Thank you. To advance right here, and here's a laser pointer.
Oh, does it advance too?
On the screen. Yep.
So it's the little arrows here?
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
great. Thank
you.
you.
Hi, I know there's a few of you were asking for coffee, so there will be some more coffee coming out in the hallway here in the next 5 minutes or so, so feel free to get up and grab that.
Yeah, if someone could bring me coffee too, because I just had lunch. Good afternoon, everyone. Glad to be here, and I've been really impressed so far by just the quality information and the presentations. And I'm always, it's to me, coming from the government and seeing what actually happens out in the real world in terms of the innovation and the expertise that's being brought to bear on solving these issues, it's very impressive, and it often makes me realize that I might be a little out of touch. So bear with me. Great work, and I think that it really, in terms of building long-term resiliency, there's a lot happening out there that's happening not because the state is requiring it or even encouraging it, but because you're good stewards and being smart business people. So thank you. So my talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about, specifically about the experience, the Washington State model for drought response that we just applied in 2015, and what I kind of see some challenges in that model in adapting to the future with climate change. And a lot of people talk about 2015 as sort of a sneak preview of things to come. I like to use the kind of the movie trailer metaphor, as you can see from the screen. And so we got a kind of a good glimpse of what the movie's going to be about, kind of the general plot line, who the characters are, maybe who the good guys and the bad guys are, but there's still a lot about the movie that we don't know and that we'll discover as this story unfolds in the future. So, drought. It's something, climate change, we're moving more towards a sort of a permanent change in the regime, but drought is something at the state level. In our model, it's been viewed as something that happens once in a while. It's an episodic thing of limited duration where you have these anomalies. Things get extreme for a while, but then they revert to a kind of a condition, a normal condition. And so Washington statewide drought, we've had 3 statewide drought declarations in the past 15 years or so. This is a time series from the drought monitor, just to kind of give you that sense of things getting drier, hotter, more severe, but then those conditions ameliorating as well. And so, and we've, I think as John mentioned, we don't have a lot of history recently of extended droughts. We've kind of been maybe spoiled about, we have a water year, and then as we move into the fall, we're able to hit the reset button and get a fresh start for the next year. And in the future, that reset button may not be as effective. So just to put 2015 into context here, and this is, I'm going to focus on Washington State, so sorry for the Idaho and Oregon folks, but you can probably relate. So, 2015, past 86 years, in terms of statewide runoff, if you were to aggregate the runoff for the entire state of Washington, and then rank it over the past 86 years, that was our lowest volume of runoff in the past 86 during the summer months. Although the winter months were, 15th highest, 32nd highest, fall and winter, up there normal to above normal. This is a slide I'd like to share just to put the meaning of temperature. And what these do is this is, again, hydrographs for the entire state of Washington. This is from USGS, showing the water year. And the first year in the upper left-hand corner is 1977, which for Washington State was our driest winter on record, October through March. But it had normal temperature that year. 2015, we had normal precipitation, but it was our warmest year record. And you can see that the outcome of each year's were similar. In fact, even though we had more precip in 2015, we had lower volume of runoff that summer. So kind of brings home the significance of higher than normal temperatures and what we're looking at in terms of long-term hydrology. And 2015 was also different than our prior drought years in that it was really a statewide drought. The conditions affected watersheds all across the state, including the west side. The west side was probably actually relative to normal, worse off than the east side in 2015. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that we did have an extended dry period in addition to our snowpack drought in 2015 in April, early summer months. Okay, so our just real quickly, some sort of dull bureaucratic things. But we do have a drought framework that's established by law in Washington. We just don't wing it. The legislature has defined what drought means, and it has established a framework for what drought response means. And our response targets water supply emergencies. It's an emergency response model. And it limits the duration of our drought orders, our declarations, to 1 or 2 years, okay? So there's the assumption there that, again, drought is a limited thing that comes and goes. And as we move towards conditions where last year becomes, we move from the sort of the periodic to the more chronic, this model might start to creak and break down a little. So our definition of drought in Washington, it very much targets water supply. I think we heard the definition this morning. Drought is when water is not sufficient to meet needs. And this is kind of a variation of that, where the legislature has declared drought to be when water is less than 75% of normal water supply. So they've kind of defined a line where needs aren't met. Plus, there is hardship associated with that deficit. And so if you have that lower water supply plus hardship, and by hardship, It's not defined in statute. I define it as impacts that hit hard, and these are things that, economic pain for growers, environmental stresses for wildlife, those kinds of conditions. So we have this definition, 75% of normal, and it of course assumes that normal was a nice steady line, probably that continues on for eternity. But in fact, normal is a moving target. And our baseline for normal is a 30-year period of record. It's based upon the Northwest River Forecast Center and their, that 30-year timeline that meteorologists use for base periods. In the lower right-hand corner, you can see that these are different overlapping 30-year periods starting in 1931. And you can see that, and this is for April through June, that normal, that baseline, does change, and it evolves over time. It has declined that spring period. And so it's a little bit like limbo. As we go forward in time and we have less runoff during the summer period, that 75% of that normal is going to get a little lower, maybe a little hotter, and so that those drought triggers are going to be triggered under more, we'll say, stressful conditions than they were historically. Again, more hydrology, perfect for after lunch. And what I wanted to show you is, as John mentioned, that the hydrograph is moving earlier in time, more towards your winter months. What this data shows is going back to 1930, kind of the allocation of statewide runoff between winter months and summer months. And what you can see is it's kind of like a Pac-Man, where over time, the winter and the fall and winter months are constituting more and more of that annual runoff, and they're taking it at the expense of your spring and summer months. And so, 1930, 1980, it was a 45%, 55% split. 2015, it was a 75-25 split. So a pretty big difference. Okay, so what does a drought declaration do, other than let the public know that we're concerned? Well, it authorizes the ecology to do things that we wouldn't be able to do under normal circumstances, emergency type responses. So permitting of emergency water rights, authorizing emergency wells, that's probably the core of our program in the Hoekema Basin, where you have irrigation districts. Because of their water right status in terms of seniority, they lose access to their full water supply. To compensate for the access to surface water, they can apply to us to use groundwater instead. We authorize that, but as part of our program, we require some payments. We take that money and we will go and we will buy offsetting water to compensate for the impacts of that pumping. We also have a grant and loan program, which might be of some interest of you folks if you're in conservation districts, irrigation districts. Next time, if you missed it this time, where if you have a hardship, you can apply to us, and assuming the legislature has provided money, we can provide some relief to you. So just kind of some maps here showing where the action happens in terms of emergency permits in Washington State. And I like to refer to these kind of areas as the kind of these Fertile Crescent areas on the east slope of the Cascades. So, each statewide drought, there is a similar pattern. And the height of our activity is in the Hoekema Basin, where you do have those junior districts that need to access emergency wells. We did have more action on the west side in 2015 because, as you noted or saw, the hydrology conditions were severe, not just on the east side, but also on the west side in 2015. One thing that's quite interesting is that the number of permits from 2001 to 2005 to 2015 have dropped considerably. I have some hypothesis what that might be. I'm not sure they're right. I like to think that it means that water users are getting much better at using water and making that water go farther in terms of meeting their needs. It could also mean that, after they needed an emergency permit in 2001 or 2005, they took some kind of action to, have it a permanent solution to their predicament. Okay, this just shows you the location of emergency permits in the Yakima Basin. I just wanted to point out, so these are different irrigation districts. You'll notice that the bulk of the activities are in a couple of them, Rosa and Kittitas. These are junior districts in the Yakima Basin. And then you'll notice the Columbia Basin project. So same drought, same year. Columbia River, though, was okay. So you have a disparity in vulnerabilities amongst water users, largely depending on their status in terms of water right holder. So drought doesn't affect everyone evenly, and neither will, of course, climate change. Okay, we're working on improving our drought response, and one of our challenges is when you're in this emergency response model, you're looking at the river forecast, and as that forecast, and here's like a typical water year, starting in October, the ideal situation is you would know next summer how much water is going to be available. We don't know that. And so we monitor snowpack conditions and other factors going through the winter, looking at the river forecast of snowpack. As we get closer to the springtime, those values, the forecast tends to come into clarity. The error bars on the forecast start to narrow. But we might just get the clarity at a point where it's too late, because agriculture, they've had to start making their planning and investment decisions the previous fall. And then also in early March, if conditions are such that it's drought conditions and an emergency declaration is issued, the state has to respond quickly and kind of put things into play. And so it was a big challenge for us. We did, I think, actually pretty well in 2015, but we're looking at ways to make our response a little more nimble, looking at improvements in our forecasting so that we could get even a few extra weeks would improve our response. So a lot of kind of neat things or powerful things coming down the pipe from the National Weather Service and NOAA and NIDIS, but then also looking at pre-staging of state things, agreements, water leases, pre-approved transfers, that sort of thing. So in the case of drought, the state can move more quickly and deploy help to where it's needed. How am I doing? 1 minute? All right. Okay, I think this is my last slide. So our current drought model, people ask, is it the model for climate change? And I think it'd be a fairly limited response. Probably not a good model. I think climate change really is going to require more long-term investments in resiliency, more permanent infrastructure projects, expedited decision-making in the height of a drought, where you're getting applications on grants and applications, trying to make a turnaround of 15 to 20 days. May not guarantee the most strategic investments. And challenge we faced in 2015 is that entities would apply for some kind of relief, say in August. We would not approve grants if they could not show that that project would have value in that drought emergency. And so that simply wasn't practical for many applicants to plan and design some kind of infrastructure improvement before, say, October, or the predicted when conditions were going to get better. And obviously, water supply challenges are complicated. They require long-term investment of resources, dialogue, and partnerships. And tomorrow, Tom Tebb, of our Office of the Columbia River, he's actually out of the room right now, he's going to be talking about kind of the long game that the state is doing in terms of water supply challenges. So that's it for me. Thank you.
I'm hoping to get another.
Hi, I'm Lanaya Blakely with the Oregon Water Resources Department. And I'm going to talk about stakeholder influence on Oregon's climate change-related water management policies. There will be a little bit of redundancy from what you've already heard, so I'll try to be brief. I'll talk a little bit about challenges to managing water, how stakeholders and water resources work together, and opportunities for stakeholders to participate in the development of drought policies. So in Oregon, like most of the Pacific Northwest, climate change will likely increase the instances of drought. And drought has been on Oregon's mind for a long time, and in 2010, we developed a climate change adaptation framework. So when we compare the primary climate risks of the adaptation framework, and this is identified in the orange column, to the natural hazards of the Oregon Hazard Mitigation Plan, the relationship between drought, increasing temperature, and changes in hydrology become apparent. Climate projections show that hydrology in the central and eastern Oregon will likely transition from a snow-driven to a rain-driven system, and will likely experience warmer temperatures, flood events, decreased runoff during the summer, and reduced recharge to groundwater aquifers. And conditions in 2015 look very similar to these future projections. So these two maps show precipitation and temperature from January to September in 2015. And on the left side of precipitation, you can see that Oregon experienced precipitation that was much below average, while also experiencing record high temperatures. These conditions culminated in drought throughout the state, and as illustrated by the Drought Monitor, over 67% of the state was experiencing extreme drought. And because of these conditions, 25 of Oregon's 36 counties requested state assistance. So scientists have described the 2015 drought as a warning shot of what the new normal may look like under climate change. And the big takeaway that we got from that event was that drought needs to be a major component of how we manage the water resources. Oregon Water Resources Department's directive is to serve the public by practicing and promoting responsible water management. And this is achieved by addressing supply, restoring and protecting stream flows to ensure the long-term sustainability of Oregon's ecosystem, economy, and quality of life. Or you can think about this as serving both our in-stream and out-of-stream needs. So the question becomes, how do we serve the public when there isn't enough water, and how do we incorporate drought into this mission? So there are four main challenges to water management: uncertainty, competition, perspectives, and priorities. How, where, and when drought is going to occur is very difficult to predict, and the conditions that we're observing are diverging from historical trends as a result of climate change, and you've already heard a lot about that. Drought is complex, and it presents itself in many different forms. It's slow to develop, slow to subside, and it affects everyone, although the direct impacts are still not well understood. In addition to the uncertainty of when drought will occur, decreasing supply and increasing demand creates competition for water resources. So the image on the left is August available stream flow, and you can see that it's very sparse. It's identified in purple. This is caused by less precipitation and a shift in the timing of the precipitation. And on the right, you'll see two maps. One identifies increasing agriculture demands in the east and increasing municipal and industrial demands in the west. And this is from our long-term demand forecast that came out in 2015. This is caused by the longer growing season and the anticipated increase in population. An individual's perception of water is shaped by their unique water needs, their history of regulation, and personal values. The diversity of the Oregon experience makes balancing stakeholder values very difficult. And what I mean by balancing is determining who gets what first and when. So we're talking about water right holders, certificated water right holders. What is obviously water, but it's also money for infrastructure improvement projects, and it's data that helps us understand the resource. So how this all is achieved is by soliciting stakeholder feedback. So stakeholders are anyone who's involved or affected by a course of action, and specifically for water resources, that's individuals that can represent a wide range of interests and the diverse statewide perspectives. That includes individual water users, tribes, agriculture advocacy organizations, industry, conservation groups, municipalities, and local jurisdictions. There are many benefits of stakeholder participation, both for the state and for the public. It's a process that allows for two-way communication that ensures a broad range of interests are considered. It identifies data gaps and anticipates future needs that water managers may not have thought of. It provides transparency for the public, and it holds water users and state officials accountable for the success of a policy. The process manages stakeholders' expectations because difficult decisions are often required, and it builds commitment for a strategy by creating a starting point of common understanding of the benefits, costs, and risks for a particular policy, and that in turn informs discussion and decision making. So the efficacy of this process is dependent on creating a productive environment. And that means creating a code of conduct early and by acknowledging stakeholders' objectives, obligations, and concerns. It's incumbent that stakeholders demonstrate respect by listening and considering opposing views, and trusting that the process will reach a mutually acceptable conclusion by active participation. Water Resource Department is often perceived more as a regulatory entity than an advocate, and this has made it difficult for us to build trust in some communities. So by incorporating more stakeholder feedback and encouraging partnerships, we're hoping that this change the perception of the department. Stakeholders can formally influence water policy through three main processes. One is by contacting their local political representative, and the governor and the legislature can in turn tell the department what to do through executive or legislative initiative. Alternatively, a stakeholder can go directly to their regional representative on the Water Resource Commission, and that they directly oversee the department's activities. And an option for stakeholders to become directly involved is through the department's Rules Advisory Committee, also known as the RAC. And this process helps the department create policies that local communities can agree with and hopefully ensures that they're effective. So the collaboration in Malheur Lake Basin is an example of how stakeholders are influencing management policy through the RAC process. And this basin was going to be closed because of declining groundwater levels and would have resulted in the denial of 39 pending applications. So during the process, stakeholders identified alternative actions, including a list of consensus-based priorities, and created a general framework that allowed the basin to stay open until additional information could be gathered. The framework includes a groundwater study, local advisory group, and quarterly study updates to ensure that stakeholders weren't surprised by any of the study conclusions, and community collaboration on any action resulting from the study. Without stakeholders acknowledging the problem and participating in realistic discussion and making difficult choices, opportunities for future development in the basin would have been unrealistic. So let's get back to climate change. How are stakeholders influencing climate change water policies? The department has two main types of tools, the response-based tools and mitigation-based tools. Mitigation tools are proactive in nature, and they're usually a longer-term strategy. And these can include expensive projects, and they're dependent on stakeholder commitment and local partnerships. One of Oregon's mitigation tools is the Integrated Water Resource Strategy, and this is our long-term plan for managing water throughout the state, and it's currently undergoing its first 5-year update. The Policy Advisory Group is made up of 18 stakeholders who are charged with evaluating the strategy, assessing its progress, affirming and creating new actions, and deciding how to incorporate drought resiliency. And this effort should wrap up later this year, and then those recommendations will be used to revise the strategy. Response tools, on the other hand, are reactive in nature and are meant to be implemented during a drought event. Oregon's water shortage powers are water rate transactions that can be implemented during a governor-declared drought, and the 3 identified in blue are the most commonly used tools. The Task Force on Drought Emergency Response, established by House Bill 4113, is an example of a legislative initiative created in response to the 2015 drought to improve Oregon's drought response tools. The intent was for water users to directly inform the legislature of how they thought the tools could be improved, independent of the department's goals. 15 members were appointed by Governor Brown and the legislative leadership. Several steps were taken to reach agreement on how to improve these tools. Brainstorming ensured that ideas covered a broad range of perspectives, and that the group considered any of them. Members were responsible to provide information on any idea that they proposed, and that created accountability. So everyone had to do their homework. Experts were solicited for information to promote a realistic discussion based on the benefits, risks, and costs for each idea, and this created a collective knowledge base to inform the decision-making process. They also had the difficult choices to narrow down the list of their ideas, and deciding on which ideas would move forward was achieved by quantifying support and priority of each idea. Task force members sought information to fill gaps and discuss concerns, and worked together to develop the language of the report, and then voted on which ideas would eventually make the cut. Transparency was one of the most critical elements of the final report. It was essential that the ideas task force members painstakingly crafted were adequately portrayed, and the level of support was identified. And as you can see on the left, support for each recommendation is underlined in red. There were over 50 ideas that were suggested, and it was important to the group that those not be lost and could be used in the future, and so those were included in Appendix D. The final report had 13 recommendations and implementation actions, and the report was submitted to the legislature on November 1st, and those recommendations are already being used to inform the decision-making process in water management. Implementation Action C, to review and propose drought tool improvements, is currently ongoing by the Water Rights Services Division. And the Field Conservation and Outreach Coordinator was suggested by the governor's recommended budget. So these are just a few examples of how stakeholders can participate and affect change to water management policies. And the Water Resources Department thinks that stakeholder involvement is critical to water management in the future, especially during climate change. And I hope I've encouraged you to take an active role in how your resource is managed. Thank you.
Thanks, Lanaya. Oh, and I forgot my advancer. I have it. I'm going to.
So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the climate impacts on priority date and reservoir carryover in Idaho over the last 3 years. 2015 was the drought of record for northern Idaho, and I think Washington, probably was close to the drought of record, and Oregon experienced significant drought. In southern Idaho, 2015 was not our drought of record. We actually did a little better in some areas in 2015 than other years, but we've basically seen a lower than desirable supply of water from 2012 onward. With the exception, it looks like this year is going to turn back around toward wetter. And so I'm here today. I'm an employee with the Idaho Department of Water Resources, but I'm here to talk mainly about my graduate research, which is focused in linking climate to the state's water planning model. I started this project as a graduate student and then got hired on by the department to help link so that we can run our planning model historically under current water management scenarios, and then potentially as projects develop we may need to run some into the future under climate scenarios. And so most of my research has been involved in this realm of linking climate and crop water demand to priority date, because priority date is the single most important factor that affects irrigators, especially in southern Idaho. We have 2 types of water. We call it the natural flow. That's the flow that would be in the river if there were no reservoirs. That's what we allocate under our priority system. And we allocate all of our water rights one right at a time. And we do it in a conjunctive way where we allocate both our groundwater and our surface water systems conjunctively, although that's been a struggle, and we're working our way through that portion of it. And in general, last year, 2016, was quite an interesting year, because in the upper Snake Basin, which the Snake River gets most of its water supply from the area around Yellowstone and Teton, and Island Park, kind of that region along the Idaho-Wyoming border, and we hit record low base flows toward the end of the summer, actually throughout the summer, even though we had a normal snowpack up in the mountains. And part of that was due to the way the snowpack came off, and also due to temperature. And so in 2016, even though the last half of the year was cool, we had no rain coming in, and we had very low base flows. And although we had a normal snowpack, we ended up with priority dates that were down at a drought level for natural flow. We were likely, as the climate gets warmer, we're likely to see more issues with that. And we get questions about that all the time when we go out and we talk to irrigators. Is this something that we're going to see more of? And so the impact on the priority date and on reservoir carryover is going to be heavily influenced specifically by basin. And so if you look at the Snake River Basin, in general, our basins along the south are storage dependent. They're typically lower elevation basins. They get most of their runoff coming early in the spring before irrigation demand kicks in. They store that water in the reservoir, and they allocate based off what actually physically arrives in the reservoir. The basins along the northern portion of the Snake River Plain, those are mostly natural flow basins where they irrigate primarily on their natural flow rights, using storage just to finish off their crops in July and August. And this is a very general statement. And then the bulk of the supply, as I was saying, comes from the Snake River, where it originates up in Island Park in the Yellowstone-Teton region, and users throughout who depend on the Snake River itself as their source, there's a really mixed bag. You have a lot of users who are completely dependent on natural flow. You have some that are almost entirely dependent on stored flow, and then everywhere in between. And so how you're impacted, and we'll see some specific examples. I don't have time to get into too much detail, but I'm going to look at the Hawaii reservoir system, because that's the water supply there is split between eastern Oregon and western Idaho. And then we'll look at what's called the Big Lost River Basin. There's a river that flows out of, it's a small high elevation basin, whereas the Hawaii is a large basin but low elevation, and it has been severely impacted by this last 4 years of drought. And if you look, this graph comes from the Natural Resource Conservation Service, and from 1939 to 2015, if you look at that supply, what they need for a full allocation is roughly 400,000 acre feet. The reservoir has the capacity to store about twice that amount. And if you look from 1939 forward, you can see on this bar, the dark blue is the reservoir carryover, and then the light blue is the runoff that occurs between April and September. And so you can see that the reservoir and the natural flow coming off have pretty much met the demand all the way until 1992. That was the first year the Hawaii Basin really got hit by a significant drought. And then we go forward. In 2003, they were a little bit short, and then all of a sudden, we have 2012, and if you look at the runoff there, most of that carryover was carried from the previous year, 2011, and we had very little runoff. Maybe I can use this. Very little runoff. That's the runoff, the spring runoff, and then we had a very low runoff the following year, and then after that, 2 years of drought, and that's had a big impact in the Hawaii Basin on water supply. And what it's doing is it's pushing people toward these conservation projects, like we heard from the farmer in the Mud Lake area. And if you look at what's happened over, and on this graph I just show 14, 15, and 16, but this is the median snowpack. This is in the Hawaii Basin at a high elevation snowtail site. And over the last 12, which I didn't show, 13, 14, 15, and 16, our runoff has always come off during this period ahead of its normal depletion date by about 2 weeks to a month. If you look at 2014, we didn't accumulate good snowpack, although it came in finally, but then it came off relatively fast, but very little of that got into the basin. And part of that is the Hawaii Basin is extensive in land area. It's very dry, and so it needs a good fall rain to come in and charge the soil column, and then you need some rains to come and hit that snow and drive it off and down into the reservoir system. This is at the higher elevation portion of the basin, and here's kind of where a bulk of the basin is kind of in this lower elevation range. And you can see they didn't develop the snowpack much in 14 and hardly any snowpack at all in 15. In 15, you can see that the snowpack started melting out really early. And that had a dramatic impact on the overall runoff and eventually the water supply to the irrigators. 16, we finally filled the reservoir up and they got a full allocation, even though the runoff came about a month early. And you can see here, this graph shows the Hawaii River above the reservoir, and you can see that snowpack melting off pretty early all these years. And when you look at the overall condition of the reservoir, I've included all the years since 2011. In 2011, they're about 100,000 acre feet, and then they came, and with the Hawaii Basin, you get all these rain on snow events that surge water off and can fill your system. But if you don't develop that snowpack, or it melts off early and it melts slowly, you don't get that. You don't end up with the runoff. And this is what has happened in the last couple of years that has really hurt the irrigators there. So this is 2011. Then it comes to 12. Started out full, very little runoff, and then they start depleting the reservoir. 13, they came in lower. Again, just a little bit of runoff, depleted down. 14 and 15, they just couldn't get up to this 400,000 level, even close. And then finally in 16, we brought it back, it came back up. And that was mainly because we got precipitation coming in at the right timing. And so I'm going to just go through these slides really quick. These are conditions. You can see the warmer than normal conditions. This is January. These are temperature anomalies. So this is January, February, March, April. Will be in the next 3 slides too. This is 14. We'll then go through 15 and 16. But to mobilize that snowpack, you need the precipitation. So if you're looking over here, you want to see that precipitation come in. And in 2014, there wasn't much snowpack, but you can see it spike occasionally with the precipitation. But in 2015, we didn't have that, and that snowpack just got absorbed. So there's the snowpack in 2014. Hardly anything at all. This is the Owyhee Basin right here. 2015, the snowpack in March was pretty extensive, but not very deep. And so we didn't fill up the reservoir there either. And then in 2016, we had that deep snowpack. Most of the basin had melted out at this point, and I flew over here from Reno to Boise, and it was just, you could just see everything running because we had the rains coming in on top of the snowpack. So with that, what we see in the Owyhee Basin is, and the expected results we expect from this drought is a significant decrease in gravity-fed irrigation, which is mostly furrow there, and a lot more conversion over to sprinkler systems. And this will probably result in greater consumptive demand in the basin, greater consumptive use, especially in good water years, which will mean less water downstream. So that's something we need to plan for, and that's why we're looking to, that's why my research is focused on linking this water use to climate, so we can go back in the historic record and forward in the future. And then, which will result in overall less snow flow in the Snake River. And then we can see those warmer winters are really threatening the supply of these lower elevation basins. So now I'm going to quickly run through a few slides on the Big Lost. Here's our runoff coming through. On this side is our precipitation graph. The green is normal precipitation, and you can see 14, we were low on precipitation. It came in February and March. And so what happened on the reservoir system is we didn't have a lot of precipitation. We got some runoff, not very much, 1,000 CFS, but the irrigation kicked on right in May, and there was no rain in here. This is just the temperatures warming up and bringing the snowpack off. And so the reservoir system just started depleting immediately. And these major diversions on the Big Lost Basin, they ran out of water mid-July, which they typically run their irrigation into September or October. So that was a very dramatic impact in 2014. The timing, though, was much better in 2015, even though the snowpack was less and it started melting out earlier. The runoff came with the rain, and so it mobilized it, and because that precipitation came in here, it cut the demand, and so the reservoir started depleting, and then the irrigators turned off, and they were able to fill this reservoir on junior priority dates, and then they drained it out and they had a full irrigation season. So now when we come to 2016, we have a normal precipitation here. The black line is the precipitation. Over here we have the early melt-off. And what we see here is that we get a much higher runoff. And what happened is, even though we didn't have the rains so much that cut the demand in May, we had the runoff. We had some runoff coming. We had a little rain in here that slowed down the demand, but because we had so much water coming off, it was they were able to meet all their irrigation through natural flow, and so they were able to fill the reservoir, and they didn't start using storage until July. And that's what's pretty normal for the system, is to have a pattern like this, where your runoff comes more in April, May, and even into July, And so they're able to use the natural flow to irrigate and then the storage at the end of the season. And that's what didn't happen in 2015, didn't happen in 2014. They just immediately drafted storage. And finally, if you look at the accounting data on the basin, I'm developing accounting to track the natural flow and the storage use. This is for the Moore diversion. This is their natural flow use. So they use a lot right in the beginning for pasture that they'll then allow to dry out. And then they use their storage to finish off some of their grain and alfalfa crops. Mainly the alfalfa, the grain starts coming off. They start taking that out of irrigation sometime in July, depending on the climate. And then this is the overall diversions for the basin itself, which mimics the Moore diversion. But you can see this is typically how it should work. But as climate changes, if the runoff comes early, they don't have that much storage capacity, so they end up using up that storage, which is what we saw in 2014. And with that, just some quick conclusions. The low elevation basins are losing the reliability of supply. Those that had a reliable supply, those that had a lack of a reliable supply have an even less reliable supply. High elevation basins are going to need more of that storage, and those who have the storage contracts will be in better shape going forward than those who rely on natural flow. And I think I'll just go ahead and call it good there since I'm out of time.
Thank you, David. Let's welcome Lanaya and Jeff back up for questions, if that's okay. Sorry to make you get up again. And yeah, does anyone have any questions?
Are there any questions?
Can you talk about the possibility and kind of the political climate or whatever associated with potential additional storage projects?
I don't think I can.
And here I'll go ahead and speak as a department employee. There's a real desire by the governor to build some storage projects to increase our ability to deal with the greater variability we've seen lately in climate. So that was actually one of my first projects at the department, was to look at the possibility of building a reservoir on the Weiser River and how that would impact the overall conditions for the Snake Basin.
The Water Resources Department has our place-based planning program, as well as feasibility and development grants and loans. So I think that was mentioned earlier this morning, that there are irrigation districts that are taking advantage of those resources for various projects, including storage. So that's one avenue that we're making those projects possible.
Also, I would like to mention that storage is not, reservoir storage is not the only tool we have to deal with the conditions we're seeing. The state of Idaho is also heavily involved in aquifer recharge projects, and then we're quite happy about the work being done between the surface water and the groundwater users to try and solve things outside the court. So there's a number of ways that things are approached besides just more storage, but definitely storage is on the table if we could get approval for it.
I'm going to take the coward's way out, and Tom Tedd of our office at Columbia River will be talking tomorrow from Ecology, and that office has done a systematic look at storage opportunities in the Columbia Basin. But I'll echo what David said, that there's storage and then there's storage. I think new dams, still very controversial. You know, we're just down the road from the White Salmon River, where a major hydroelectric facility was removed, detonated a few years ago. So I think dams are still hot button issues, but there are opportunities to say, at existing dams, enhance the storage that might be less controversial, or optimize the storage between different facilities, aquifer storage. And it really, when you think about storage, you get down to the micro scale as well, like we heard with dryland farming, storing, moisture retention and soil. That's kind of at the micro level. And then low impact development would be another non-dam form of storage. So I guess, when you think of storage, think of things other than Grand Coulee. Okay.
I guess, when you're talking about stakeholders, you're talking about, to the impression I'm getting is, the big water users, and yet you're not talking about the general public. And the general public, and the reason I say that is because, quite frankly, I was a tribal leader a few years ago, or a year ago, and during that time, one of the negotiations they were talking about, well, what are you guys doing about general public? How are you getting, why should I conserve water as a farmer if you're not getting the Joe public to start using water more conservation wisely, things like that? So how are you educating the general public?
That's a very good question, and one of the positions, the field coordinator and outreach position that I mentioned that the governor included in the recommended budget was specifically because Water Resources does not have a community outreach position. So we have very limited capacity to actually educate the public on our various conservation programs and opportunities that are available to individuals, not just large irrigation districts, for example. So that is something that we are trying to address through getting funding to have at least a person that can be out there in the community. But also our water masters work directly with individual water users. But there's challenges there too, because in the 2015 drought, the western side of the Cascades, the Willamette Valley, experienced regulation, and many of those areas had never been regulated before just because it's a much wetter system. And so history of regulation and just exposure to the department and what water right regulation is also another component to that. So we're hoping with additional resources we can improve educating the public on the tools that we have and how important it is to conserve water.
I think your question is really good. In Idaho, the Department of Water Resources is focused on supply. We don't touch the quality issue. That's a different department. But also in Idaho, we have a very conservative mentality, and we want solutions solved at the basin level, ideally. And so in our state drought plan, a lot of what we try to encourage is the users getting together and at the smallest possible levels solving the problems rather than the heavy hand of the state coming in to do a curtailment, because that's one of our major approaches. And so currently there's an effort going on throughout the Pacific Northwest with the drought early warning system, and the state, I've been a participant on that on behalf of the state, and we're trying to initiate some pilot projects, not the state directly, but the state is trying to encourage various groups to get together at the smaller scale to deal with the type of issues you're talking about. But I don't believe overall we have a general, in Idaho we don't take the approach of trying to handle things at the state level first. We usually try to handle things at the basin level first.